might have noticed a very subtle change in the way that the rest of the New Testament refers to the Lord after the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. If you recall, when the angel announced his birth, they said he will be called Jesus. That's the Greek version of Yeshua, Joshua, which means in Hebrew, God saves. And in the beginning of the Gospels, he was called Jesus. But after many assertions that he is the Christ, if you will notice from Acts on to the end, most of the references to him is the Christ. Why is that? We think it's Jesus Christ. It's correct to address him as that. But that's not his full name like our names are. You have your first name and your last name, Merlita Salamat, right? But in this case, Jesus is his given name, his name by which he is known by those familiar to him. But Christ is not so much a name as a title. It's like Julius Caesar. He is a Caesar. He is a titled emperor. In this case, the Christ means he is the anointed, the chosen one. And I tried to keep that in mind when I made the outline. It says, Christ died and was buried. Christ lives then and today. And then we are to study how are we to comfort those who have gone before us. How are we to look at our own death and dying? Because, we're different people. Gender, age, occupation, size, mental and health conditions, so different from each other. But we have one thing in common. Our time will come to an end. We will all die at some time, some sooner, some later. We don't know the time, but it will happen. So we need to know what lessons we can learn from the resurrection of Christ that will help us face our own death and dying and to comfort those who die in the Lord. So let's begin. We know that Christ was crucified and died. How do we know that? Let's open our Bibles to John 19, and we will read the account of the soldiers who were there at the crucifixion, verses 32 and 35 of chapter 19. Who has that? John 19, 32 to 35.
Until 35? Until
35.
But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe.
The soldiers who were to make sure he was dead said so. They have nothing to gain by his not being dead, but they have everything to gain by being sure that he died, because that's their mission, that they will have to have their accomplished mission. So the soldiers, who had nothing to gain by it, testified to it. Who else? Yes.
I read somewhere that the practice during that time for all that were crucified is to break their legs to make sure they will die.
Yes.
They're not dead.
They may be suffering, but not dead. So at some point, they had to make sure. And the two thieves on his right and left, they broke their legs and they died. But when he came to Jesus, there was no need. And again, there's a prophecy that was fulfilled. Who else will know that he actually died? Those that buried him? Okay, we shall look at two followers. To this point, somewhat secret followers. But they were powerful men, part of the ruling class. One was Nicodemus, who came by night. Remember? How can I be baptized? I'm big. I can't go back to my mother's womb. He took it literally. And the other one was Joseph of a place called Arimathea. Okay. They were powerful people, and they went to Pilate. They said he's dead, but we want his body. We don't want it to stay on the cross over the Sabbath. That was one of the things that they observed as Jews in those days. So the two men, would apparently those who served them, saw to it that he was brought down. They followed, the Bible says, the burial customs of the time. Let's look at John 19. We'll jump to verses 38 to 41.
After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there.
Okay, what was their custom in those days? Apparently, a body had to be buried within 24 hours, if possible. Some say because the climate hastened the decay of dead bodies. But this is a custom that is observed by observant Jews even today. After one's death, the burial has to happen hopefully within 24 hours. He bought linen. They had a separate shroud for the body. And then they had strips of linen for the arms and the legs, and they wrap it around him. If you recall, when Jesus made Lazarus rise from the dead, he was 4 days dead. He was buried earlier, but he came out of the grave with the bindings around him. If you have seen the movie The Mummy, he probably looked somewhat like that. And the Lord said, loosen him. In other words, take out the burial clothes. But as we will find later, the shroud and the wrappings and the separate covering for his face were left behind in the grave. Jesus didn't need them anymore. He was not going to die again. He rose and lives forever. So let's keep that in mind. Can you imagine 75 pounds of myrrh and aloe? Myrrh was one of his offerings of the kings, the wise men, when he was born. Do you know 25 pounds of rice? I cannot carry it now. Now I can't. Maybe in the olden days I could. 25 pounds. That's how much spice they had. As they wrap him in burial clothes, they put the spices so that the smell of decay would not be overpowering. So they prepared him for burial. He's dead. And again, this is part of the prophecy where in Isaiah it said he was assigned with the wicked, and he made his grave with the rich. There was Joseph's tomb reserved for his family, and he gave it to Jesus. Now, the tombs in those days were carved into the hard rock. There was like an antechamber, and there were benches or bunks built on the side. So when they sleep with the fathers, they literally mean it. The tomb was a family affair. And usually they would bury or put the dead, the newly dead, in the antechamber, but after a year would revisit and the bones would be placed in the back so that the benches carved out would be reserved for those who would die after the family, the first one. So it is a family tomb, but that tomb was not used by Joseph's family as of yet. So there he is. He was prepared for burial with the spices and buried in this tomb. But more than that, it's hard to believe, but the religious leaders of that time were the ones who remembered that he said, "Destroy this temple and I will build it up." So they were afraid the disciples will steal the dead body and say, "Oh, he rose again, he's not here." So what did they do? In addition to the burial costumes of wrapping him in the shroud and wrapping the strips around and putting spices, they went to Pilate. The religious leader said, "Put a guard so they can't steal the body." Let's read Matthew 27. Matthew 27, verses 62 to 66. All right, Tess.
The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard." And Pilate answered, "Go make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure by putting seal on the stone and posting the guard.
Okay, they put a guard. There is talk because it's not very specific, but history tells us Roman guards, like the ones that guarded Paul in prison, they usually are a 16-man unit, and their aim is to take care that nobody will enter the tomb. In addition to the guard, they put the seal of Pilate on the stone that was guarding the tomb. You know what a seal is? You've seen letters, right? It's either wax that has the mark of the owner, it signifies ownership, or in official documents, It's the seal of the governing authority. In this case, it's probably, and you've seen in modern day, crime scenes where they put the do not enter crime scene. People can cut the tape, right? But in this case, it probably is either clay or something that they could put on both ends so that if the tomb is open, the stone is removed, it will break the seal. They will have evidence that it was open. So not only it was guarded, it was sealed with Pilate's seal. Come the next day. It's interesting that disciples, his followers, did not remember that he said he will rise again. It was his enemies who were afraid he would. So when the day of resurrection came, let's see what happens. First of all, the guard's testimony. What happened? They were guarding the tomb, and they were supposed to take shifts so that there will always be someone awake to make sure there's continuity of evidence that it was not open. What's the guard's testimony? Let's look at chapter 28 of Matthew, verses 2 to 4.
Matthew 20. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men.
Okay. These are not ordinary run-of-the-mill soldiers. These are Roman guards. They are hardened by training and by actual war. They may be violent, but they are strong and very willful. But when the angel appeared, what happened? They fainted. They were like dead men. He must have been a sight to behold, that angel, that hardened men of war will just fall over and faint. Okay, now that's what happened. Now, but what did they do? They ran. They didn't go to Pilate to tell him that the body is not there. Instead, who did they go to? Let's read chapter 28, 11 to 15.
While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. When the chief priest had met with the elders and they devised a plan to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews of this day.
Okay, cover up is not a modern thing, apparently. Even in those days, when the soldiers reported to the religious leaders, they said, oh, that can't happen. Here's some money. Here's some money. Just spread a rumor. What did they have to lose? They fainted. And these guys were telling them, give a different report. Here's some money to keep you quiet. So that's what the religious leaders did. Now, unbeknownst, don't forget, the disciples, most of them on the crucifixion ran away and hid because they were afraid. Okay, But the women, they wanted to do the last thing that they could do for someone they love. In the haste of the burial, they probably, Joseph and Nicodemus were not able to fully finish what they were doing. So they were going to complete what they did. They brought some spices, maybe not as much as Nicodemus did, because they were not as rich as Nicodemus. But they were going to clean the body and add on and do the last service they could for someone they loved. But they were talking to themselves. Okay, there's 3 of us. I don't think all 3 of us together can move the stone. How can we do that? Maybe the soldiers, they were really trying to see what they could do in order to go there inside. And what happened? Mark 8.
Can I read it? Oof.
Go ahead.
Thank you. 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they buried him, where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled. Then they fled out of the tomb, from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
All right. The women, believing he was dead, came to assist in his burial. And the angel appeared. It's interesting that when the angel appears, the first words out of the angel's mouth would be, "Fear not." Don't be alarmed. Don't be afraid, right? It began with the announcement to Joseph and Mary, "Fear not." And to the shepherds, "Fear not. Don't be alarmed." This is the same thing. It must be quite a sight to behold. Yes. And so they were to tell the others. How did the others react? It's interesting, how many times did Christ tell them while he was yet alive, "I will die and suffer for you, but I will rise again"? They didn't believe it. They're the ones who did not believe. They went into hiding. They thought it was a total failure. So now, how did the disciples react? Let's look at Luke 20. Let's look at John 20. John chapter 20, verses 1 to 2. Yes.
Early on the first day of the week, while he was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciples, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have been put him."
You know, they were slow to believe. Empty tomb. He's not there. Despite what the Lord said, they thought, oh, somebody took his body away. They still could not believe. So what else happened? Let's look at 10 to 16. Same chapter. Chapter 20 of John. But verses 10 to 16.
Where they were staying. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As he wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. More? He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher.
Okay. This late, Mary Magdalene still did not recognize him right away until he spoke to her. And then, after that, it must have been quite confusing. The women saw the angel. Mary Magdalene saw the Lord himself, although she thought it was the gardener, and they went to tell the disciples. The disciples believed them right away, despite what Jesus said. Let's look at Luke chapter 24. Verses 9 to 12.
When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, and he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened.
You know what is interesting? They did not believe the women. Why? They're just women. Their eyes could be deceiving them, right? There's several of them. 3 and Mary Magdalene, and it listed who they were. The women couldn't believe it either, but they had the angel, they had the empty tomb. What chaotic morning that must have been. So what did Peter and John do? I have to see this for myself, right? I can't believe the women's tales. So they ran. And the funny thing is, John said he was younger. So he ran faster and got to the tomb first. You know, the thing about the story, as the gospel writers wrote it, right or wrong, good or bad, they give the failures of the disciples as well as their achievements. Here they were very disbelieving and in doubt. They had to prove it to themselves. And John looked in, but didn't go in. Peter did. He went in and looked and saw the clothes lying behind and the napkin nicely folded. Not just hurriedly getting out of there, but very systematically organized. The Lord rose. But they couldn't believe it. So from their doubt, what happened? John 20, if we go back to John, verses 3 to 9. Did we read that?
So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb, but both were running. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying.
Okay. They saw the empty tomb. And now it's beginning to dawn on them. Remember what Christ said, I will rise again. So later on, he did appear to them several times. 26 to 29, same chapter. Could you continue?
Eight days later, his disciples were again inside the house, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, though the doors had been barred, and stood among them and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands, and put out your hands and place it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but stop doubting and believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, do you now believe? Blessed, secure, and favored by God are they who did not see and yet believe." It's all right.
Okay. Now, when the Lord appeared to the disciples, this part I don't quite understand what form his physical body was. Apparently, there is enough features for them to recognize him. So physically, they could see him and recognize what he looked like. And to Thomas, he was willing to show the scars, the wounds that he had, the nail on his hands and feet, the wounds that the nails made, and the wound in his side. We don't know if Thomas actually touched it, but we have his belief of my Lord and my God. So physically, he had some features that were recognizable. And he ate with them. He drank with them. But he could go to a locked room. So there is something the same but different. And Nobody can explain that to this day. Maybe that's what our new body will look like. We don't know. But that's an indication of what it seemed to be in his case. Now, there were other appearances. The two on the road to Emmaus, the two disciples who did not recognize him. And again, he spoke. He told them about the prophecies, about his death and resurrection. But you know, it wasn't until he came to the village with them and broke bread with them, as in the Lord's Supper, that their eyes were opened. Could this be the Holy Spirit finally getting to them and say, listen, this is Christ. He's alive and rose again. But let's look at what they said. Luke chapter 24, 32 to 32. 30 to 32.
I read it.
Yes.
When he was at the table with them, he took bread and gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. He disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?
Their eyes were opened and they recognized him. So there must have been something in there. And later on, as we read, there were also at the day of Pentecost, before the day of Pentecost, when he appeared to them, and we have that for our next week lesson, the Ascension. There were 120 witnesses, including the disciples and Mary, his mother, and they saw him. And Paul writes to the church at Corinth that there are more than 500 disciples who saw him afterwards. Now, if Christ rose from the dead, how are we to react to it? How are we to understand death and dying? If you have a loved one who has passed, and I imagine most of us have, what comforted you in your grief and mourning when your loved one is not physically with you anymore? What gave you the most comfort when someone dies that you love? Yes.
Every time this happens, I always remember the words of the Apostle Paul when he said that absence from the body is presence with the Lord. That is so comforting.
That gave you a lot of comfort. But we grieve, don't we? We mourn. But it is not a mourning without hope. Let's look at John 11, 21 to 27. This is the tail end of the story of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Lazarus died, and the Lord got word that he was sick and was dying. But he purposely did not go to him immediately. So when Martha met him, when he finally came, 4 days after Lazarus died, Martha said, Lord, if you were here, my brother would not have died. So she thought proximity to the Lord is what would make her brother well and not die. But the Lord said, what did the Lord ask? Go ahead. Yes.
Your brother will rise again. And then on 25 he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?
Go ahead, her response.
Said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world.
Her initial belief was that, yes, in the final judgment, he will rise again. But he was there to be a reason for the people to see the power of God. And though there is an initial raising of Lazarus, yes, he will die again. It's interesting that the Lord said, I know resurrection. It's not that he knows resurrection. He is the resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. So if we can believe that he rose again, we can believe all his teachings. Everything he said is true because he was able to do the hardest of all his teachings. And let's look at John 14, 1-2.
Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you?
That is what we are hoping for. He is gone now. We have the Comforter with us. But he is preparing a place for us. And we will finally be together with him. That's our living hope that we hold on to. And 1 Corinthians 15, it says that.
Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain.
So that's our living hope. Even though people die, we grieve, but not like those without hope. We have hope. Now, one of the things that I experienced when I was working in the hospital, this was in the 70s, early 80s, when do not resuscitate is not as well established as it is today. Today, you can mark your medical record and say, do not resuscitate. That does not mean pull the plug. It just means if you die of natural reasons or not intervening with the process of death, you will not do heroic measures to make you be alive again. We had a committee, because there was no established rules in those days. We had a committee irreverently called the God Squad, but it really was the Do Not Resuscitate Committee. Chief of Surgery, Chief of Medicine, Chief of Anesthesiology, and 2 civilians, the Padre, the chaplain. And I was invited to be the other civilian member of that. I did ask our minister at the time, Dave Miller, to give me some advice on how to function in this responsibility, because it was a serious responsibility. The doctor, the attending, not the resident or the intern, must present a case. And they have to show the committee that the patient is terminal, that his condition is not reversible, and that death is imminent. And the committee can ask the attending why he came to this conclusion. It was a very somber discussion. And If the attending recommends and the committee agrees, then they write on the medical record. We were told to read up on death and dying. And for many of the patients in the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, they were merchant mariners who probably left home in the 40s, 50s, did not get in touch with their families. There was no one to grieve. But if there was a next of kin, they, together with the attending, would also be in this committee, that they were not objecting to the do not resuscitate. So we are faced with death and dying. Some of us more often than the rest of us. There was a time when our minister, Charles Faust, lived out in Suffolk County and only came during weekends. So during the week, there were 2 missionary ladies who stayed in the parsonage and who helped us with the day-to-day activities that we had. And there was a couple, an elderly couple from church, whose son was a veteran from the Vietnam War and had a severe case of PTSD, post-traumatic disease. One morning, he killed himself. He was not a member of the church, his parents were. And we were to lay the wake and then bury him during the middle of the week when Charles was unable to come. And the lady said, "You have to speak," nudge. And that was just when we were sitting there, and I'm racking my brain. I do not know this man. I do not know how he died, other than that he killed himself. And I don't know how to address it. But all I could think of is he is in the Lord's hands. I cannot comment on that. That's the Lord's judgment. But his parents are here, and they need comfort. And so, that's what I said. We grieve, but we not grieve like those without hope. We have hope, and our hope is in the Lord. There was another time when I was put on the spot. One of our staff members, his elderly mom died. I do not know the mom. And here we were in one of the funeral homes in Harlem. And they said, "Say something," and you are very reluctant in those trying circumstances. What can you do to comfort someone? And all I could think of, I do not know her, but I know that she raised her children in the Lord, because I know her son. He worked with us, and he was a good man. And his other son is a preacher of a small church. So all I could say is she is blessed because she raised her children in the Lord. And they are grieving. They are mourning her, but they are grieving for the loss, but not like one without hope. How were you comforted when you lost someone? It was not too long ago that June lost his mom. And in the middle of the pandemic, he wasn't even able to go home. What comforted you, June, if you could share with us?
Just the memories, good memories she left for me and my brothers and sisters. That's about it.
It is hard.
Yeah, and it's
We grieve.
yeah.
We mourn because it is our loss. But we have a living hope. How about you, Annie? Your husband passed away 2 years ago, was it? You had just observed your 60th wedding anniversary and his birthday, but the Lord took him away. How were you comforted?
I was just glad that we were able to have that beautiful, get together. And then he just got sick. And we tried the best we could for him. But I already had this in mind. If it is your will, Lord, thy will be done. If you want him to go, if you want to take him, I know he's a good man. He's in your hands. So his life is in your hands.
Yes. I remember what Sister Merlita said, that she prayed for her dad when he was in the hospital. Could you tell us again how you felt at that time?
I was at work and all of a sudden I have I felt sad, very, very sad. So I called my dad and I said, "How are you doing, Dad?" And he said, "I'm good. I had a good breakfast. I'm going home tomorrow." And after hearing him say that, I felt better. But at the same time, I don't know why I said a prayer. I said, God, if you want to take my dad, don't make him suffer. And that afternoon, he coded and died right away.
That's the comfort we have over the loss of a loved one. How about ourselves? Last year, I had a TIA, a mini stroke, if you will. And Alex's advice to me is, Mom, you really have to accept the fact mortality is at the door. You have to get your things straightened out. I'm one who puts a lot of things in a shoebox, figuratively, and don't have everything organized and in place. We have advice to have. When we are facing mortality, not just the paperwork. We don't have too many material assets to worry about. It's not like somebody is going to inherit loads and loads. We don't have to worry about those as much. But you need to ask yourself, is it well with your soul? Can you go anytime He calls you? We should be at that place. We're like the writer of that song. Whether what happens, hardship, easy times, good times, bad times, we must be ready to say, it is well with my soul. Sister Merlita, would you pray, please?
Dear God, we are very thankful that we could gather and study your word, Lord. And it's a blessing to know that you have risen and resurrected, because that means that we have the promise of seeing you again and have eternal life with you, praising you and glorifying you. As we continue our worship, Lord, please guide all the leaders, as well as give them the words and the song to touch people's hearts as we go on. All this we pray in your name. Amen.
Amen.